Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the LCLC podcast. The first season of this podcast is devoted to compiling an oral history of the Louisville Conference on Literature and Culture, or the LCLC, a conference that began back in 1972 here at the University of Louisville and continued without interruption for 48 years until the cancellation of the 2021 conference due to the COVID pandemic. In this episode, I will be talking to Jeff Stein and Sue Kirsch in order to reconstruct the 1976 LCLC keynote address given by Paolo Solari, one of the 20th century's towering presences in the field of architecture and urban planning. A longtime Solari collaborator, Jeff Stein is the former dean of the Boston Architectural College and past president of Solari's Cosanti Foundation. He is currently serving as the liaison between the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture as it moves to its new home in Solari's Cosanti studios located in Phoenix, Arizona, and in Arcosanti, the experimental vertically integrated model city begun by Solari in 1970. Both enterprises continue to be developed by Stein and other Solari associates, including Sue Kirsch, Arcosanti's long-serving archivist. I know Jeff through a shared passion for motorcycling, a detail I mention now because it will thread its way through our conversation. One that I began by asking Jeff, what kind of man was Paolo Solari when he came to Louisville?
He was probably pretty humble and quiet. He was kind of elfin-like in stature, not too tall, which meant that he fit perfectly in the Frank Lloyd Wright buildings when he had been a student of Wright's in 1947-48 at Taliesin and Taliesin West. Wright, of course, famously thought people over 5 feet 8 were weeds, and Paolo was not one of those. I'm sure he was pleasant and curious about Louisville, and at that moment he was at the very height of his career, I would say, just coming off a few years earlier, the famous architectural vision of Paolo Solari exhibition at the Corcoran Museum, which was attended by over 250,000 people.
That's what I find amazing, that it would seem that the publications of Solari come, I guess, towards the late 60s and early 70s. I was reading an interview that you gave, Jeff, earlier about getting, I believe it's called Archology, the MIT book with the, I would describe them as wild, perhaps slightly psychedelic drawings of these futuristic visions that he had of cities. And here we are a few years after that, and we don't have any internet, we don't have any of this sort of supercharging of dissemination, but Solari has tapped into the zeitgeist and has sort of ascended into the stratosphere.
He has, and cities are the biggest, most expensive cultural artifact that we make, and yet nobody talks about how to make them or what their form should be or what even happens within them. Solari was among the first to bring the whole idea of having a conversation about cities to the culture at large, just because he was paying attention, really. I love this quote from Leonard Bernstein. Paying attention is a countercultural act of courage and resistance. And so Solari was paying attention to issues of urban sprawl and carbon in the atmosphere and the reliance on cars to get to the grocery store or take a kid to soccer practice and all of that stuff, and trying to bring not only some opinion but some real science to urban design. And in 1975, he was recognized by the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission and given a big grant, which was matched by Xerox Corporation, and that allowed him to really embark on this trip of understanding two suns archology, which is what he talked about in Louisville. One, the sun in the sky, which is really responsible for all life on Earth, and the other sun, the evolving mind and spirit of humankind. Putting those two things together as the basis for the design of three-dimensional cities. And he got a little more detailed than that, and showed some detail in the slides, but that was the beginning of something. These big grants, it allowed him to enlarge the staff at Cosanti. It's when I came on board in 1975, and to build a whole series of models and drawings, and have engineering consultants working on ways that solar cities could be designed in 7 different climate zones around the world. So that was Two Suns Arcology.
Mm-hmm. And looking at uh, the brochure that accompanied it that Sue provided to me, it says this exhibition presents a number of variations on the concept of small and large settlements, showing an integration of 5 effects: the urban effect, horticulture effect, greenhouse effect, chimney effect, and apes effect. And of those, as a Gen Xer or somebody a little younger, the one that I immediately focus on is the greenhouse effect, and because that's the one that I've heard of. And Solari writes, the greenhouse effect enables the collection of warmth from the sun inside a defined space. When combined with the horticultural effect, this provides a natural agricultural base. And what is so fascinating to me having this conversation now in 2021 is this positive spin that Solari uses when he thinks of a greenhouse effect. When I think of the greenhouse effect, I think of the term given to explain how the Anthropocene, this phase of the Earth's existence where we are able to influence its climate, has, what do we call how we are killing ourselves and the Earth? It is the greenhouse effect that is, run amok because we're unable to control our carbon emission.
Right, it's a
Solari
different
doesn't
greenhouse
see that.
event now.
Yeah. What do you make of that? What would Solari make of that now if he was in on the call?
He'd say, well, sorry, the entire culture has taken over his term, and used it to describe something negative, although it is essentially the same thing, which is if you have a layer near the stratosphere of carbon that provides warming of what's below it.
Mm-hmm. Sue, did you want to comment?
It makes me think of the cities that, the models of cities that were built for the Xerox exhibition. Jeff showed the little catalog, and you are reading from the catalog. And what those cities have are practical arrangements, absolutely practical arrangements, where each model or each design is fit into a specific climate zone, but the designs also have an energy apron, a greenhouse that is usually on a slope leading up to the city. So the horticulture effect of things being grown there for the city, and the idea of the warmth of the greenhouse being collected and pumped into the city as a source of energy, it is all really a practical thing. And that this word, or combination of words, has taken such a different spin, is curious, really curious, because because Solari really was about how can we live on this planet, and to suggest practical solutions of the way that we're building right now, urban sprawl. Where is that taking us 50 years from now, 100 years from now? What are we really seeing when we open our eyes in that direction? So his whole life, and especially in the 1970s, was dedicated to trying to come up with not only solutions, but with a challenge, especially for the young students that were part of the workshops, part of the lectures. He provided a challenge. Here's a conversation. This is what we're doing. This is what we could be doing. What kind of ideas are you willing to bring to the table? I think that was his strength, that he never said, okay, that's the only solution. It was an ongoing conversation with the people around him. This is what I'm thinking, and please take a look at it. What do you know? What are you bringing to the table? At least that's the way that I interpret it.
It's
Mhm.
true, and that's exactly how it was, and it led me in my teaching career in a series of architecture schools to apologize to incoming architecture students and point out that um, our generation, the baby boomers, thought that we could help to fix things. And in fact, that's what led some 8,000 of us over a period of 50 years to Arcosanti and to help Solari with his ideas. Uh, but the culture is slow to catch on, and so we didn't fix things, and now it's up to the next generation to stand on our shoulders as we were standing on the shoulders of some people like Solari, who might have been short in stature but was really a giant in architecture, and try to come up with some solutions. You know, urban design architecture really isn't so fact-based. It's more an opinion-based practice. And Solari was attempting to bring some science into the picture with the physical effects, the apse effect, chimney effect, greenhouse effect, horticulture effect. Those are real things that you can see and experience. And if you put them together in the design of a city, you get something that may be unexpected for most people, but could really be a solution to problems that Solari saw forthcoming and problems that we're in the middle of right now.
Right. So, as somebody who's younger, I'm going to be 50, slightly younger, going to be 55. And I think about my own development and when issues of the survival of the earth and perpetuation of the life on it, including humans. I can remember my dad and I used to like to go for motorcycle rides and on Sundays, and a ride and a film and a ride and then pizza.
Mm.
That was a good Sunday for us. And one Sunday he took me to go see a film called Silent Running, and it was out in the theaters, and it's like a 1973 sort of science fiction film.
I know, with Bruce Dern, it's one of my
Right.
favorites.
I can remember seeing that film, and I was maybe 7 or 8, and walking out. You know, I think my dad was. I think we were on the Ducati, so appropriate for the Italian motorcycle for a conversation about the Italian architect, and thinking this is it. I mean, we are in trouble because I am young and I will probably see some version of what this movie is about, which is that the earth has been totally paved over, essentially. That sort of Joni Mitchell paved paradise kind of thing. And the only remnants of the natural environment are floating up in terrariums. And of course, the movie proceeds with the decision to destroy them and return to Earth. And Bruce Dern intervenes and kills everybody and dies, and you're left with these precursors to R2D2 walking around in their sort of clunky, cute little robot cells with watering cans, while Joan Baez sings a song specially made for the movie. But my point is that when Solari got off the plane in Louisville, we may not have had the terms for the greenhouse effect. We may not have understood exactly how this was going to play out, but we already had a pretty good sense that we were in a crisis situation. And I find it fascinating the degree to which, as a culture, we play this game with ourselves that somehow we didn't really know until much later. It's like we were all there. We have a much clearer sense of the looming catastrophe now than we did back in the early 70s, but we had a pretty good sense of that things were going wildly off the rails back then. Or am I mistaken? Because I was only 7 when I'm talking about this. What was your sense of it back then? Because Solari, the other thing that fascinates me about Solari is that he has this sense of, it's going to take a long, long time for people to understand how right I am. But we don't have that kind of time, perhaps. We've got to sort of understand how right Solari was in the overall impulse that he had, even if his methods turn out not to be the right ones. We've got to play catch up here very fast. Was that a sense that you had back then, or not?
Yes, it was a sense that I had back then, and a number of people around me as well, not only at Arcosanti, but elsewhere. It's an interesting condition that we're in. The problem is, of course, that lots of people in control of the culture have continued to make lots of money doing the wrong thing, and we haven't been able to sort of get ahead of that curve quite yet.
Mm-hmm. Sue, did you want to comment?
Ditto. I think there is I don't know if it's a willing blindness or, if it's not right in front of my door, why should I deal with it? And I think what has been the overarching thing about Arcosanti is people coming together because they are willing to acknowledge and trying to put something together that is at least I'm not sure what. We never got as far as we hoped we would, but at least Arcosanti is here, so it's a bit of a reminder of just the conversation. We need to think, and we cannot just merely go onwards buying the next model of car, etc., etc.
Right.
There is sort of like the me factor and not the us. What is happening to us? So,
Right.
It's Greta Thunberg had a really interesting comment lately, which was she was critical of people who say we're not doing enough about global warming and a few other issues. because to say we're not doing enough would imply that we're doing anything at all, but we're not. We're not doing anything at all about it, and the time is running short, and her generation is going to face it in a much more dramatic way than our generations.
Right. Right.
But even, you know, when we are sold an idea like, oh, electric cars, those will help. Of course, that electric car doesn't really change anything. It moves the amount of pollution from in the city to a coal-fired power plant or oil-fired outside of the city, but that's about it. Plus, the batteries of electric cars are really toxic waste after their useful life is over, and it turns out Chevrolet has just recalled every single one of the electric car Chevy Bolts that they have manufactured, 140,000 of them, because the batteries are all defective. They can explode and catch fire and all of that stuff. So it's going to cost GM $1.8 billion to replace those batteries with something, nobody knows what quite yet, and we continue on this sort of circular path of continuing to repeat our mistakes so that those in charge can continue to be in charge. Whereas out on the periphery, and Arizona, a mesa in central Arizona really is the periphery, there's Arcosanti, which is trying to show an entirely new vision about what the city could be, and how much fun we could have in it, and how supportive it could be to humankind. You know, we talk, well, people talk about sustainability, but it's unclear what we're sustaining, and how we would. In order for cities to sustain us, they clearly have to change, and Solari and a lot of people around him imagined that he had come upon one way that they could change in a really positive way. And in terms of literature and culture, he wrote a few books about it.
Right. Well, and got the attention of individuals such as myself, that is professors of literature and culture. And I studied under Fred Jameson. In an interview, Jameson said, "Realistic novels are still written, but I'm not sure that even literature itself is the main vehicle for culture today. I would say architecture has become a more influential expression of postmodernity. I think this is a period of a spatial aesthetic." And that's Jameson. You know, I used to talk about realistic novels, but now I'm going to focus on architecture because I find that architecture is the driver through which humanity is best expressing itself in our current moment. And as a student of his, I thought a lot about what he had to say, and I agree with him. And it seems to me, so on one hand, when Solari got that invitation, because Jameson is reflective really of the zeitgeist among professors in America at that time. And so the people at Louisville reached out and said, wow, we really need to talk to Solari. Will Solari come? And Solari came. And my question to both of you, and we're touching on it, is although Solari had this moment of strong interest, and I think Jameson is still right that architecture is the key to understanding our cultural moment. We're having the conversation that we're having, which is that we're going down the wrong path. What can we do to go down the right path?
It's a really poignant question, the right one to ask, and you'll have to continue asking it once the Literature and Culture Conference comes together, because I'm not entirely sure how to do this. And neither was Solari. He wanted to build a model, some of which is built on a mesa in central Arizona, some 80 people and tourists and a school of architecture is ensconced there right now. There are two things about postmodern culture and architecture. One is that architecture in the postmodern is so much more accessible to a larger public than most literature. It's probably the case that much of America is actually illiterate entirely, and even the literate folks aren't going to read Jacques Derrida um, too closely. But if you walk past a building that is quoting from the past and yet its spatial layout is clearly of the future, you can sort of get that. Architecture is a storytelling art. It just doesn't tell too specific a story so that as people go past it or experience it or inside it, they can tell their own stories or see how it influences them. The problem with architecture and cities and arcology too is that it's really expensive. Architecture is. It's so much more expensive than a book. A building, one's home, a university campus, a corporate headquarters, they're the most expensive things outside of maybe an aircraft carrier that people purchase in their lifetimes, and so to change course with architecture and city building from essentially building the cheapest stuff that you can and flipping it and letting it exist on the planet for 20 years or so before it's torn down and some other cheap thing put up. To change from that mode of thinking and acting on the earth to a different mode that is a group of people coming together and collaborating and building something truly expensive, but which is going to last for generations, is a big step to take culturally.
So I agree with you, Jeff, and I think that's profoundly put. At the same time, Solari, his methods to go back to casting in the ground and to produce these things that are functionally doing what we want them to do, but in terms of contemporary aesthetics, people I think tended to call this sort of stuff brutalism. That the culture doesn't seem to want to embrace that. The need to take actions that are close to hand and efficient and readily available. Why do we continue? It's hard for me to look at Arcosanti and say, wow, that's really beautiful. How do we change that attitude?
Well, that's the continuation of the same question we asked about 10 minutes ago. There is a myopic, how would you say, underlying a way of the way people deal with the world. I think Solari went as far as to say that the architecture that we live in really shapes what kind of society we are. And if we are just continuing to drift, then what will come out of that as a species, we have intelligence. And if we were to really look at the reality of our existence, then shall we not participate in our own evolution? And one of the things that would be most important is to look at what kind of architecture we are building for ourselves and for future generations. And so it all ties together. He had a very simple and practical approach and tried to build a model. Basically, if we can't just talk about it, the best way to show what we're doing is to build an example. But as to society at large, even wanting to understand, that's a question that will continue to puzzle, I think, all of us.
You
Why?
know, the 1960s were a really seminal time. A lot of things were going on. The late 60s, the great student revolts, and the end of the Vietnam War for the United States and some other countries. And we put the Apollo program, a man on the moon. The first Earth Day was 1970. But what was really going on then was the self-help movement, psychiatry, people going for therapy. This really took off among the general public for the first time in the 1960s. The notion was that we could be better people than we were. We could be a better, more inclusive, more interesting culture than we were. And Solari's idea, since he was trained as an architect, Doctor of Architecture from Torino Polytechnico, and then a year and a half with Frank Lloyd Wright, his idea was, well, if we want to be better people, we're going to need better architecture to support us to be that.
Mm-hmm.
We can't continue to just live as hermits in our little suburban enclaves, but we're going to have to come together in cities in a way that maybe we did in earlier times, but we haven't since the Industrial Revolution, and make some beauty out of that. And so for his aesthetic and a few of the rest of us too, Arcosanti, those buildings really are pretty beautiful. There are some ways that if you really thought about it and took a step back, most of what we build in Western civilization, especially in the 20th century, is horrifying, actually.
Go,
And
go away. Yeah.
and so to have an alternative to that was Solari's idea. He had his own aesthetic, but there are about 110,000 registered architects in America, and more than that worldwide, and other people um, like professors of literature who understand architecture and what it can do. Those people can come together and devise their own ways of dealing with this thing, but they can stand on Solari's shoulders and use some of the things that he discovered and put into practice at Arcosanti, and create something that looks a bit different, but would function in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Paolo Solari's idea was that cities might be the newest organism on the planet. And if they were to be sustained and to sustain us, they need to be designed the way all the other organisms are designed. That is, like us, three-dimensional, compact, complex, these bodies. If if our bodies are either too small or too big, um, people are interested in that stuff. But when they're just right, then we're able to go about lives on Earth and really do some interesting things. because of the way we're designed, for better or worse, we're the most powerful species on the planet. And I talk about that in a couple of minutes too. But because of how we're designed, we can become William Shakespeare or Bach or Matthew Biberman. It's fantastic, the possibilities for us in this design. And so Solari imagined that there would be just as many fantastic possibilities in the design of cities that weren't just spread out for miles along the ground, but could be built up and focused inward and instead of outward. And so his notion of archology, architecture, and ecology as two parts of the same thing, really hit a chord among quite a few people who were searching in the 1960s for a way that we could move ahead, that the culture could evolve, and that humans could socially evolve as well. Turns out that didn't really happen, but we have that model that we can still cite and see what we can do with it.
Right. Well, another keynote, and I'd like to explore this one much later. The French philosopher Alain Badiou gave an address around 2006, and I invited him. And the thing about Badiou is he's got a book called The Century, and he would come into this conversation and say that in his sense of time, and his big book is called Being an Event, and of human development, that we've essentially frozen at that moment, that 1968 is the way that he would style it, and that everything has been a reaction to try to arrest moving through the revolution that we're pointing to as what needs to happen if we're going to survive. That we can see what it is we need to do, but forces of counter-revolutionary forces, Badiou would say, have prevented us from stepping forward, so that in a certain sense we haven't advanced at all from the precipice of where we were uh, at that moment, where we had, if anything, more hope to actually cross the precipice and move on. And I guess that's what terrifies me, is that obviously we're sitting here and wondering if we're going to be able to make that jump and see the earth and the human animal continue on into the future or not.
Wow, Alain Badiou, that must have
Yeah.
been really something, because I can only agree with him 100%. Yes, that's where we are, and there are forces that are trying desperately to stop us from taking the next step. Wow.
Right. You know, the other thing that I would mention too is that, and I guess as we're kind of coming around and wrapping up our time together, and Jeff and I was saying, have this shared, and it's come up a couple of times, affection for motorcycles. And I was talking about casting in the ground, and we were talking about BMW motorcycles. Myself and my dad and my family's associated with the English-made Vincent motorcycles, and I had the opportunity to have Phil Irving, who was the chief engineer of the Vincent motorcycle, and before that, Velocette, stay. He's Australian, and stay at the family house in Norfolk, Virginia, on one of his visits to America. And he's of that same generation, that the Solari generation, sort of the great modernist generation, where you can talk to somebody about what it was like to realize that you're riding a motorcycle so you could use your feet to do the controls too. It didn't have to all just be through your hands. And what was it like to design a foot shifter? I mean, what was it like to design the first foot shifter, one of his jobs at Velocette before he moved on up? And the Vincent team fell into casting in the ground when they realized that their motorcycles were so fast that the brakes weren't sufficient, and they hit upon the idea of putting another brake drum on the other side of the wheel. Nobody had thought to use the other side of the wheel. So they cast more brake drums at the Isle of Man in the ground, and they were sufficient to go out there and perform. Another old friend of mine and my father's talked about, God, the guy's the name, Burt Monroe, well known for the world's fastest Indian. And
Sure.
my friend told me that when Burt hauled pistons out at Bonneville, he would fix his pistons and cast new pistons right out of the ground in the salt. So necessity is the mother of invention, and we just seem to have gone away from the intuitive ability to utilize things that are right at hand. I don't know when we're going to get the impulse to go back and do that sort of thing.
Yeah, you bring up a really interesting issue, which for Solari was part of his genius was he could make something out of nothing, which was casting wind bells at first and then parts of concrete buildings in the ground using the dirt piled up as a mold for these things, and could turn out beautiful objects as a result of it, as well as Phil Irving did, and others of that generation. Now we talk about that stuff as maker culture, as if it's something really extraordinary. What, people can actually make things? It's not just typing in front of a screen that you can do with your life all day, but you could actually make something. Wow. And in fact, our parents and grandparents' generations actually did that stuff.
Right. Sue, did you have any last thoughts on this topic, or something that you would like us to circle back to?
All sorts of thoughts. Part of it is the education, the level of everyday education that the kids in the last 2 or 3 generations have gotten. The fact that kids are sitting in front of the television instead of playing outside in the mud. So I think the maker generations before simply grew up with a different in a different set of circumstances, and it would be really good if the kids of this generation went back outside to play and got away from the fear mongering on television and from the fear mongering of their parents of, oh my God, you can't play outside alone. I mean, what kind of a society are we really grooming right now, away from the fact of the pandemic in general? So I think Solari had some really good things to suggest to us, and I think we're very lucky that somebody like that came.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
One last question as we wrap up. And I struggled with the phrasing of this question, but then I realized that there was the way I wanted to ask the question was, I am now the director of this conference that's had a 50-year history, and certainly in the 50 years of this conference, there have been a lot of things that have gone right for this conference, and certainly there have been a lot of things that have gone wrong. And in this kind of conference, no doubt there have been opportunities for abuse, and no doubt as the director, I have to accept that this organization has overseen some good things and overseen some bad things. And I know that Arcosanti and the Cosanti foundations have had to deal with the revelations that have come out with Solari and his daughter. What advice do you have for me? I see how Arcosanti has handled it. What advice do you have for me so that I can handle those kinds of issues? Because it's inevitable as people and organizations that this is an issue we have to handle.
I guess you can just be as transparent as possible and understand that people who do great works sometimes have some flaws, just like the rest of us who don't do great works. But really, how selfish do you have to be to make a great work of art? Really selfish in terms of your time, in terms of what your focus is, in terms of all sorts of things that may be outside the bounds of polite society. And there's a difference between someone's personal life or dysfunctional family and the work that has happened. I think every human has flaws. All of us do, and while we can't excuse them, at least perhaps we can forgive them and see what good they produced and build on that.
Sue, any thoughts, Sue?
I can only second that. Thank you, Jeff. That was a very good way of dealing with that question.
Thanks, Jeff. It's certainly something that I will keep with me when I have to cross that bridge, which no doubt we all do in our own ways. Well, I'd like to thank both of you for taking time out of your day to help us talk about the 1976 keynote that Paolo Solari gave to the Louisville conference. And I hope perhaps one day again we'll talk another time about some other aspect of literature, culture, and architecture.
Oh, I do too, Matthew. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you and to talk to my old neighbor in the East Crescent at Arcosanti, Sue Kirsch. This is great.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to be part of this. So best wishes. Best wishes to you, Jeff.
Oh, yes. And best wishes to you, Matthew, as you continue to direct this conference, which is really the only one of its kind. And there you are.
My thanks again to Jeff Stein and Sue Kirsch. I thank you for listening and hope you will continue to do so. More importantly, I hope you consider joining us for an upcoming LCLC conference. Consult the LouisvilleConference.com for details.